Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. Today we're going to be talking about the ethics of the INFJ, a topic that I think is not explored that much within the literature, which is interesting and makes it a worthy topic to explore. I hope you enjoy it. Just briefly, before I move on, I want to remind you that I've written 2 books in the last year or so. The older one, The Ecstatic Soul, the kind of authoritative philosophical exploration of the INFJ personality, and The Infinite Castle, my new novel, which is a novel that I really recommend if you want to support my work. Both are available in the description box below. All the links, they're both less than $10. So why do I say that the topic of the ethics of the INFJ is a topic that's not very often explored? Because you could certainly make the point that in a lot of descriptions of the INFJ type, one of the themes that appears most often is the theme of the INFJ person having a very strong code of ethical conduct. And this is a theme that you'll find in a lot of somewhat mainstream descriptions of feeling types in general. The thinking types are somehow, described with less of an emphasis on morality. Now we might agree with this, we might disagree with this. This is just what the current mainstream descriptions look like. And the reason why I think that predominance of the topic of morality and descriptions in the INFJ is not equivalent to the question of the ethics of the INFJ is that, well, first of all, this idea of INFJs as having a strong moral code, moral behavior, is unanalyzed. It's not really explored in detail. It relies on intuitive notions. It relies on fictional portrayals of characters that we see as INFJ characters. And just more generally, I think that it just lacks in a certain amount of clarity. And so the topic here is essentially geared towards trying to understand the relationship between ethics and being INFJ in a little more detail. And this may or may not surprise you, but I like to go a little bit against the grain, because in all my explorations and meditations on this type, it's tended to converge toward the idea that actually the notion of a very square, rule-oriented commitment to external morality is not really the go-to of the INFJ. And you can actually give a relatively straightforward reason for this. The reason being that external or even internal, somewhat rigid systems of ordered rule following. You shall do this, you shall not do that. There are certain things that I don't do. In this case, you have to, there is an absolute requirement to follow up on this or that. These systems, morality systems, in terms of a system of rules, in terms of oughts and ought-nots, is a system that is, to its core, saturated with the judgment. And a judgment, by definition, is the outcome of a judging process. So a judgment is a piece of propositional content, an ought content, that has, in various ways, issued forth from a cognitive process dominated in large part by a judging process, what we would understand in the MBTI terminology as a process dominated by a judging function. And so from this perspective, it's not actually that surprising that perhaps the two or three, let's say, most influential works of ethics. I want to say the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. I want to say the Critique of Practical Reason, as well as the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant, and Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. I mean, these works were all authored by philosophers and thinkers of various sorts that are, I mean, if you look online, generally and by consensus understood to be, in the case of Aristotle, ENTJ, in the case of Immanuel Kant, INTP, in the case of John Stuart Mill, INTP. So what you have is three authors that are pretty overwhelmingly considered to be judging dominant types. One is TE dominance, the others are TI dominance. Again, I think that the question whether the morality source is internal or external is actually secondary compared to the fact that there seems to be a certain correlation between writing works of ethics that are designed to, at least in some sense, and they've been successful in this respect, designed to inculcate a framework for people, outside these books, people who have read these books, people who have been influenced by people who read these books. These books have essentially birthed the three main strands of morality systems nowadays, in the Western world at least. The Nicomachean Ethics is the blueprint of what we consider to be virtue ethics. Now, works of Kant on morality have birthed what we consider to be the ethics of duty, deontic ethics, and obviously John Stuart Mill's work has birthed utilitarianism. I mean, via Jeremy Bentham and a few other thinkers, but it's the kind of Bible of utilitarianism. So what's really interesting to point out in this case is that those hyper-influential books that are the heart of most systems of morality nowadays, well, were all written by thinkers. I mean, that's the first thing that you notice. So that to some extent gives the lie to this notion that thinking types place the question of morality less centrally than other questions. But you'll also notice that there's no INFJ in there. And that's my topic to some extent, isn't it, in this video, is to understand the place of the INFJ in relation to ethics and to moral systems. If you think of Wittgenstein, if you think of Schopenhauer, if you think of Spinoza, if you think of even Plato, okay, let's say these four INFJs. I mean, Wittgenstein had very little to say on ethics. He thinks ethics can already even be talked about. Schopenhauer doesn't have a huge amount to say systematically about ethics. He has pronouncements on ethics. As you know, he's very attracted to the ethics of the Eastern religions, which is also interesting because it seems to be speaking a lot to his NI. But, he doesn't have works of ethics that are systematic and aiming to provide a blueprint for people to follow, certainly not. And in the case of Spinoza, the ethics is a work, so you want to say, okay, well then, Spinoza clearly has written on ethics, but if you read the ethics, you'll notice almost straight away that it's really more a work of metaphysics. It's called the Ethics because Spinoza understood this work of metaphysics to have ethical consequences, but it doesn't provide a blueprint for, at least certainly not a set of rules for how to live your life. I mean, you could make more of that argument in the case of Plato, but even that is debatable. I won't go into the detail of Plato because it would take too long, but suffice to say, you can also take Nietzsche, who's usually seen to be an INTJ, but in certain systems is actually more associated with INFJ. And I think that hypothesis is not as preposterous as it sounds. Well, I mean, Nietzsche was very preoccupied with morality, but he certainly didn't want to, his readers to embrace an external or an internal system of rules. And he thought that was the very center of, what he would call the ideology of resentment. The overman was as you well know by now, a man or woman able to unshackle themselves of this burden of having to follow a set of rules. So, if anything, in the genealogy of INFJ writing, what you see tends to be, an attitude that distances itself from having a rigid moral code. Problem is that when we speak of having a rigid moral code, and when we speak of an individual or a type that tends to distance itself from that, now maybe our first reflex is to assume that it's almost like we're talking about a type that is by essence amoral or immoral, which is obviously not something we want to say. Now, notice that we also don't want to say that the INFJ personality is by essence moral, because that's a mistake, and it's the kind of error that a lot of online mainstream descriptions push us into. We don't want to essentialize type. We don't want to say that just in case someone is an INFJ, one is likely to be a very moral person. There's absolutely no reason to assume that an INFJ is more likely to be a moral person than an ISTP or an ESTJ or an ESFJ or whatever you want. This will really depend on the individual and the choices they make. But what we can discuss is how the cognitive makeup of the INFJ with their hierarchy of functions is going to influence the way that they perceive the approach and notion of a moral life. And I think that, having researched this question a lot, both in my readings of authors, in some of my writings, including in the Ecstatic Soul, and in observing INFJ personalities in the real world as well as online, I think that it seems pretty clear to me, but also the viewers will be able to comment in this video down below, that INFJs, of course, like most people, strive to be as morally respectable as possible, and having a respectable moral life, a life where commitments are upheld, is an important part of what they value. It's an important part of their value system, not least because they are, after all, high FE users. Let's not forget that. But the dominance of introverted intuition is really, really important to emphasize here. We're not talking about a type that is primarily dominated by a judging process. The judging process is here, but the overarching process is a perceptive process. It's a perceptual process. It's an intuitive process. And it seems to me that, sure, the INFJ attempts, like I said, any other person of any other type to be, by and large, morally decent. But the crux of this approach is usually not going to be in terms of having either an external or internal baggage or list of rules according to do's and don'ts. I think that this is going to appeal, just like in the case of the authors I mentioned earlier and the 3 important books leading to 3 different approaches to ethics. It's going to appeal more to judgers, whether introverted judgers, whether TI or FI, whether extroverted judgers, either FE or TE. Now, of course, there will be differences between these types, which I will not be able to dwell on in this video, but when your dominant function is a function of judgment, you are going to approach particular data for decision making, such as moral decisions, in terms of discriminating between pieces of information. Do this or don't do this. Do that or don't do that. It's about making a judgment is usually discriminating between different pieces of information. This is what judgment is. That's not what the INFJ primarily does. You can really imagine how introverted judgers would naturally be oriented to that, and also extroverted judgers. Extroverted judgers will have different way of getting to that information, but they will essentially also be guided by this distinction, this discrimination between different pieces of information, where here, having a clear template with implicit or explicit rules is going to be extremely useful. The INFJ doesn't proceed like that, and to the best of my ability and the best that I have been able to collect in terms of my observations, is that a lot of the time for the INFJ, being morally satisfied, being morally balanced, is actually very much a matter of being healthy in some sense, of not having their flow interrupted by things external, the best version of themselves, something like that. It's really the idea that, in some sense, if they are able to flourish in their perception-dominated world, if they're able to be in harmony with themselves, maybe the notion of harmony, which is a notion that exists in ethics, but is a little bit underappreciated because it's not really a notion that is systematizable. And you can understand by that it's not a notion that is going to appeal a lot to T-dominant thinkers, the ones that tend to dominate those works of ethics. Like the notion of being in harmony with myself, with yourself, with myself too. Something that you can find in Stoicism, for example, in the Greek philosophy of Stoicism. You can find that to some extent in Spinoza. Let's make this clear. You can find a lot of that in the Eastern religions. In some sense, quality moral decisions will follow from having your own being in harmony. So it's not about having rules for making actions. It's more about having an awareness of what is necessary for your internal well-being of your being as a whole. Not just your moral side, not just your moral actions, but if you have a healthy being, you will make healthy decisions. And so it's something that is much more at the level of how the whole being is perceived, how much balance there is, how much harmony there is. And if there are ways of getting to a more harmonious state, like maybe meditation, maybe self-care of various sorts, maybe reading books too, that's a good thing, but they will never be seen as rule books. They will never be seen as concrete templates. They will usually more be seen as an inspiration, as an open door towards maximizing that harmony. But let me know what you think in the comments, because I'm curious to hear whether you relate or whether, on the contrary, you're actually a bit more rule-oriented than that. All right, enjoy the rest of your Sunday, guys, and I hope the weather is better than it is here, because here it is desperate. Don't forget, you can also follow me on Patreon. Link is below. Bye-bye.